Welcome, everyone. This is Karen Souza, Training and Certification Director at CTAA. We're happy to have you join us for our 1-hour webinar about service animals, best practices, and policies. We welcome John Ahlen, Accessible Services Specialist with Lane Transit District in Eugene, Oregon, also a recent graduate of our Emerging Leaders Academy. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Taylor McGinley, our communication specialist, for a few of the important points you need to know before we begin everything on the tech side. Take it away, Taylor.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this is just kind of a refresher for those of us who have used Zoom and those who may have not used it in the past. If you have any questions for John throughout this webinar, please make sure to kind of hover your mouse over the video screen. And at the bottom, you'll see a button that says Q&A. If you go ahead and click that button, you'll be able to put in any question that you have in there. Now, we will be holding all questions until the end, and John will then go through and address as many as we can with the time that we have left. So like I said, just make sure that you hover over the screen. Right next to the participants button is a button that says Q&A. You'll be able to type everything in there, and John will be able to get through those. So now, without further ado, here's John.
All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our chat today about service animals. I'm John Ahlen from Lane Transit District in Eugene, Oregon. I'm the Accessible Services Specialist. I'm working right out of our busiest transit station, working every day with service animal handlers and questions that arise around accessibility, ADA, and working to ensure that our disability community can get where they need to go. So I'm looking forward to being able to go over some of that with everyone here today. We'll have a copy of this presentation available for download, and I'll do my best to save some time for questions at the end. And in particular, I feel that that's often where some of the best work gets done, is talking through some real world examples. So I'll do my best to make sure we have plenty of time for some questions, but otherwise our time today is going to be brief. So I'm going to be very quickly going through quite a bit of information. So to start off with, I just want to make sure that I give thanks to everyone participating today, as we all have a role to play in helping people get where they need to go. I appreciate CTAA's involvement just for being a resource and in connecting all of us. You might also consider checking out their Emerging Leaders program. It's been tremendously supportive of my work, and also thanks to my employer and main source of transportation, the Lane Transit District. We were the first fully accessible fleet in the nation, which took a certain amount of forethought and commitment to do that work before the ADA even existed or required it of us. And we continue on in that spirit today. And finally, thanks to our local disability community and local groups, without which none of this would be possible. So the saying goes that nothing about us without us, and so we all need to be mindful of that when developing our own policies and procedures. So I'm going to very quickly go through some foundational material and discuss what we've done to make our service accessible for service animal handlers. I'll touch on some of the regulatory do's and don'ts and provide some context for policy-making decisions. Now, if you're hoping to be pointed to a manual that tells you what is allowable in every given situation, this is not that today. So instead, think of this as a cultural competency exercise. And my aim is to build up critical thinking skills so you can make well-informed decisions based on the information you have available. There's still some bright line rules, so I'll make sure to note those as we come across them. And I'm also going to talk about what we've done in our pilot program at Lane Transit. But what works best for you may be a bit different than that. We're still learning about what works differently, whether it's in a big city, a little city, different geographies, different modes of transportation. So if you're interested in helping us and trying something similar in your community, make sure to be in touch afterwards so we can talk more about that. Now, no matter our role, we are all responsible to be trained and ready to appropriately respond when someone brings an animal into the workplace. It cannot be the sole responsibility of a specialized employee, and bus operators need to be prepared when people with disabilities have immediate needs or requests. In short, when someone comes in with a service animal, we need to provide equitable service as we would with any other passenger. Many people will safely assume that a service animal is a dog, and few people may have heard that a reasonable accommodation can be considered for a miniature horse. For your own information, a miniature horse is even smaller than, say, a Shetland pony, and it may be used because it can perform many of the same tasks as a service dog, and is especially helpful because it typically has a much longer lifespan than a dog. It also does not carry some of the same cultural or religious stigmas that a dog might. However, the FTA regulations specifically mention that when the Department of Justice narrowed their definition of a service animal to dogs in 2010, the Department of Transportation regulations remain broad. As transportation providers, guess which regulations we fall within? So if someone says that they have a service monkey that is trained to pick their medication off the ground, it's possible we may be required to allow it, whereas in many other contexts, it could be denied. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that every type of animal can be suited to being a service animal. And as they are so rare, it's best to evaluate non-canines on a case-by-case basis. What we cannot do is require some kind of certification, and there's no federally recognized certification or registration program. Despite what some internet sites selling service animal ID cards may try to tell you, we can't require any kind of visual identification, such as a vest, and anyone can buy one if they wanted to. Sometimes it's obvious that someone has a service animal with them. Guide dogs for the blind became established in the US in 1942, and at that time, this was the generally recognized stereotype for what a service animal does. Nowadays, service animals provide a seemingly limitless number of different tasks to assist people with disabilities to go about our daily lives. Someone with a disability is well within their rights to train their own dog that they picked up from the pound to perform a task to assist them and enjoy the same protections as someone with a professionally trained guide dog. Generally, somebody has met their obligations to us when they tell us that their service animal performs a trained task to assist them with a disability. A service animal might be trained to repetitively tug on someone's sleeve until they stop harming themselves, or tuck themselves between the handler's head and the floor while they experience a seizure. It just can't be a natural dog behavior or providing comfort through their presence alone. Typically, those could fall into another category of animal, and there are many different terms for them. You might call them emotional assistance animals, emotional support animals, therapy dogs, pets. For our purposes, there are service animals, and there's everything else. So subject to your own state's laws, we generally are only required to accommodate service animals as we defined earlier. The ADA doesn't generally cover service animals while they are still in training, but most states do, with the exceptions being Hawaii, Michigan, South Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming. Here in Oregon, we clearly have some responsibility to accommodate service animals in training, but what that means is that the animal has already been trained as a dog. What it is still receiving training to do is to perform that task to assist someone with a disability. So for us, that means, just like with our human passengers, no barking, no biting, no being aggressive or lunging, no accidents on the bus. I'd suggest that's a good threshold to consider in your own transit district as well, though there are exceptions. So for example, if someone's service animal barks to remind their handler to take their medication, we should be accommodating that. What is not allowable is uncontrolled barking. So the animal should be under the full control of their handler at all times. Also keep in mind that just like us humans, a service animal can have a bad day or a bad moment. So if bad behavior comes up, typically a reminder is warranted with an opportunity for the handler to correct the behavior. Another exception is that someone may be unable to use a leash due to a disability or because of the task that their service animal performs. In this case, an alternative such as voice command is acceptable, but the service animal must always be in the full control of its handler. Once we've established that a dog is a service animal, the only other responsibility we have is to ensure that it is behaved while on our property. So you should know that it's not good etiquette to feed or pet or otherwise interfere with a service animal while it's working. Many states have criminalized interference with a service animal performing its work. The only states that have not currently done so to any degree are Alabama, Alaska, Iowa, Maryland, Montana, and West Virginia. There's nothing wrong with keeping an eye on an animal for behavioral problems as you would with any other passenger. We're only allowed to ask 2 questions, and 2 questions only about somebody's dog. So we can ask them whether it's a service animal, and if so, what task has it been trained to perform? That second question is because not everyone is clear about what is or isn't a service animal, and it can be legitimately confusing for some about the status of their own animal because so much depends on context. There are different rules that apply if you're in an apartment, on an airplane, in a restaurant, or on a bus. So we can ask to make sure that we have the same definition of a service animal if it isn't clear. We can reinforce or redirect back to these questions if someone doesn't give us a satisfactory answer. So if we ask what task a service animal performs and its handler starts telling us about what they had for lunch, we can remind somebody that, well, it's all very interesting. We don't need to know about their lunch, and what we're actually asking about is what task their service animal performs to assist them. So go ahead and get your answers to those 2 questions, but we're not allowed to dig any deeper than that, even if it's well-intentioned or if we're just trying to make conversation or if we just find it very interesting. We also can't require any kind of documentation as a prerequisite for boarding. So we must allow for the possibility of someone coming onto a bus without advance notice and having no documentation or being marked in any kind of way. So we can't ask for details about why someone needs a service animal. We can't ask someone to demonstrate the task that their service animal performs. We also don't ask about what someone's disability or diagnosis is. All right, it's time for a pop quiz. So I've already gone over everything you need to know. So when you ask someone what their dog does and they say PTSD, what's the next step? So I want everyone to just take a second and really think about what you do. So is this a service animal? A, not a service animal? B, you don't know? C, or are you pretending you don't have to know the answer? D. So if you're feeling really confident, go ahead and write your answer into the comments. I hope everybody just takes a minute and really think about what you do in this kind of situation.
And just in case you're not sure where the chat is, it's just right below the participant box, and you can kind of chat to all panelists.
That's great. We're getting some A's and some B's. Nobody's attempted to phone a friend yet. It's a pretty good split between A and B. Just a couple more seconds, then we're going to move on. Okay, so mostly A's and B's, a handful of C's. I'll say that I've asked questions like this or similar to this many, many times to hundreds of people, and I get similar kinds of responses. There isn't general consensus or agreement, and oftentimes rooms can get divided, and even sometimes in groups, people can get heated about feeling that they're really right, that it is or it isn't a service animal or one of the other answers. And let me tell you a little bit about this example in particular. So in this circumstance, remember, we don't care what somebody's diagnosis is. Knowing that someone experiences PTSD doesn't help us know whether their dog is a service animal. So they've disclosed to us information we don't need about their diagnosis, but nothing about what task their service animal performs. So when we follow up, it could go either way. Someone might tell us that their dog is cute and cuddly, and that having it nearby helps them feel calm, and that assists them with symptoms related to their PSD. Or they might say that they're a returning veteran and that their animal is trained to scout a room and report back that it's safe for them to enter. So we don't know, and we need additional information to evaluate the status of an animal. So it could go either way. I'll also tell you that this is a very typical and common response someone gives when being asked about the task their animal performs. Someone might respond, PTSD or seizures is another common one. Asking what tasks the dog does to assist them with their PTSD usually gets us there on the second try. But it's important to keep in mind that if all someone discloses to us is information about their health history or their diagnosis, we actually don't know anything about whether or not it actually performs a task to be able to assist them. So I wouldn't suggest that you feel bad if you got that question wrong. It's purposely designed to be vague and to encourage a lot of different types of responses and to just show how critical thinking can be really important when evaluating the status of the animal and how often we as folks working in transportation field get these kind of things wrong every single day. So typically, we ask that our operators call it in when asking questions that they remain unclear about the status of an animal. So under exigent circumstances, it still may not always be obvious in a situation what to do. When someone is just trying to get somewhere and the bus is already running late, it's not a bad idea to err on the side of allowing the animal and monitoring its behavior. So one of two things can happen. Either the animal is perfectly well behaved, or if not, the animal can potentially be removed, as you would with any other problematic passenger. One of the concepts that we integrate at Lane Transit is that good customer service is accessible, and accessible service is good for customers. So my office is in the middle of our busiest bus station, and I get to hear all about the good and the bad about everyone's day, including all the complaints we receive. Here's a couple of different examples. Someone might tell me, John, I just moved here from California a couple weeks ago. I've gone everywhere with no hassles about my dog, and I've even ridden a couple of your buses before without anyone asking me any questions. And here all of a sudden comes one of your drivers and they're grilling me about my dog. So obviously the problem must be with this particular driver. So what this tells me is the importance of consistency. So if you have operators that aren't doing their due diligence, they're just passing the buck on to the next operator to have to deal with. It also makes the organization look bad for not being consistent. And depending on how we're being inconsistent, it could be discriminatory. Far more often though, we hear that an operator asked way too many questions. So the passenger on their way to work doesn't want to hear about how an operator has a cousin with a similar condition and was cured by eating nothing but cabbage for 3 months. Let's just stick to the 2 questions about their dog and stay clear of asking or talking about someone's health history or their disability status. So we've talked a lot about what we are required to allow, but there are circumstances in which we can remove what is clearly a service animal. So we can exclude for an uncontrolled behavioral problem. Outright aggression could be immediate grounds for exclusion. An unprovoked bark is typically going to be cause for a warning and an opportunity for the handler to make a correction. You have to use your best judgment in these kind of circumstances. If it's a long inner city route and the dog barked twice in the last hour, that's probably not going to be something actionable. But if you've warned the handler and the dog keeps barking so loud that no one can hear the stop announcements, it's interfering with the public's ability to use the service. So this threshold is only going to hold true for things that should be within the dog and the handler's ability to control. So if someone can't access your service because they have dog allergies, that's just a part of being in public. So it's not grounds for exclusion. The direct threat language that's used for exclusion is actually quite narrow and a bit specific. So it has to be a credible threat to others, and it can't be a stereotype based on a breed or the size of an animal. So in the real world, this wouldn't even be practical, though some places have tried to put some regulations on pit bulls, for example. One thing to keep in mind is that breeds may be particularly well suited to assisting with a particular type of disability. So for example, you might need a large dog to pull a wheelchair, or a small dog you can carry that can smell your insulin levels. So breed restrictions can be discriminatory in a very targeted way. Even if allowable, it would be a nightmare to try and enforce it. So how much pit bull would be too much pit bull? Is half or 50% too much? And then how do you know how much pit bull a dog is if it's crossed? You know, is someone going to do genetic testing on service animals now? And who's going to volunteer to pay for that? So it just becomes logistically impossible to try and enforce at that and regulate at that level. It also has to be something that can't be accommodated. So if someone pulls out a doggy diaper or a muzzle and it remedies the problem, typically we're going to need to at least entertain it. Depending on the circumstances, you might even set up some kind of conditional amnesty from an exclusion that may be contingent on the accommodation being in place. So for our dog allergy suffering rider, we might offer that they try and stay at, say, the opposite end of the bus as the service animal handler, just as anyone who might be, say, scent sensitive might do with someone who's wearing heavy perfume or cologne. So we have to be able to navigate those situations as they arise, and sometimes be able to come up with creative solutions that help everyone get where they need to go. Behavioral problems can be very context specific, and we're allowed to treat them on a case-by-case basis, as long as we're applying that consistently, meaning not in a way that can be perceived as being discriminatory. There shouldn't be any problems. So, for example, someone might have a dog that acted up, but across from them was another passenger provoking the behavior. Even a very well-trained service animal can fall into bad behaviors when they're in a confined space with other dogs or food on board. However, over time, an animal with truly problematic behaviors typically isn't going to have an isolated incident and will be well known to your staff. Got a message about volume. I'm just reading that. One moment. If can folks hear my volume levels okay? Okay, good to go. Let's see. So it is important to note that when we exercise an exclusion due to an animal's behavior, we are excluding the animal and not the human. So this isn't usually practical in transit, but theoretically, someone could hand off their poorly behaved dog to a friend and get right back on the bus. So keep in mind that the language written into a formal exclusion should be specific to that handler's animal. However, in the real world, often when there are problems with the animal's behavior, I found that there are some correlations with problems we experience with the human's behavior. So it can sometimes get a little bit less simple than that. So we've got a link to our full report on our website at ltd.org. In short, kind of the way that we do things at Lane Transit is we allow everything that isn't a service animal in an enclosed carrier. So for service animals, we allow for someone to voluntarily add a paw print endorsement onto their rider card. I've got a picture of one of those on the screen. So we use this as an additional eligibility criteria for participation in half fare on our fixed route service. So generally, I think most folks here will be participating in some form of half fare program, and one of the conditions of that is that we have to essentially make space for folks who require some kind of reasonable accommodation in either the service, planning, facilities, or design to make full access to the service. And so typically we see having a service animal in participation in the paw print program is meeting one of those requirements. Now, what the paw print does is it in turn lets our drivers know that this person has already been asked about the status of their animal, so they don't need to be asked again every time they board. One of the advantages of a paw print program is that it gives a transit agency an opportunity to go over expectations with the passenger and answer any questions that they may have. So for example, while somebody is getting their paw print, I can let them know that we expect their service animal won't be blocking any aisles or paths of travel and should remain on their person or tucked safely under their seat. Even for particularly large animals, I remind handlers that for their own animal safety, they don't want their dog's tail sticking out in the aisle while we've got a 600-pound power chair going through. It also gives us an opportunity to ask the two questions in a low stress and low stimuli environment. Someone who may have difficulty responding to questions to a driver running late with a line full of people waiting to board can instead take their time when the stakes aren't quite so high. Because this program must be voluntary, it's important that there be incentives for both riders and drivers for them to meaningfully participate. For riders, this has been widely successful because if you use public transit to go between work and home every day with just one transfer in between, you might be getting asked up to 8 questions about your animal every single day just on transit. And we just cut that down to 0. For our operators, they've loved having the boarding process sped up and taking some of the guesswork out of evaluating an animal. So this creates some synergy between both our riders and our drivers, and really being able to make sure that we're simplifying the process, make it quicker and easier for everyone involved, as well as removing some of the conflicts that can arise. So when we have someone come forward and we ask what the status of their animal is and what task it's trained to perform, and they respond and they say PTSD or they say seizures, we in turn see how this can become very complicated very quickly, and people may come to different conclusions. That can be an incredibly frustrating experience for a service animal handler. And it can in turn really lead to conflict. People may feel that they are targeted towards discrimination, or it may just seem inconsistent. One driver told me I could ride, the next one told me I couldn't. And in addition, what I found is that even with very specific training for employees and for our operators, this is just one thing of many, many things that we expect a driver to be remembering throughout their day. And odds are, when we want them focused on driving in the road, it can be a little bit of a distraction. And so if we can alleviate that through a program such as our paw print, it just makes for a better experience for both our riders and our drivers. And that's certainly what the evidence that we've seen based on our post-participation surveys. So we have full information available in a report on our website, and that in turn helps to provide some additional guidance for folks that are interested in developing a similar type of program of their own. The intention being to remove some of the guesswork about the status of an animal, and instead being able to centralize that in a voluntary way while incentivizing participation to service animal handlers. So we've often found that drivers become our biggest advocates in referring people to participate in the program, and we found from our riders often that upon participation, it's just made their experience easier, faster, and better in being able to ride public transit, and in fact, even riding public transit more frequently. So by taking some of the frustrations out of the process, by making it a more streamlined boarding experience, we found that people will choose to ride public transit more often. So that winds up being beneficial to everyone. So when developing policies, one of the most important considerations is that it should be everyone involved. Be easy because for me, if you're having to overly incentivize a program, it's not it's a skill, and it generally takes some experience and practice for many people to do an excellent job at it. For some, there can be a temptation to try and make things easier by taking an extreme position. There's really no shortcut, and I'm going to talk about some warning signs that I've noticed and some steps to try and get people back on the right track to being successful in their interactions. The good news is that pretty much anyone can get this right, but sometimes a new way of thinking needs to evolve or open up first. and that can take time. However, if someone has the willingness to learn, they're going to get there eventually. So during trainings, I'm on the lookout for someone who has a list of what makes a service animal legitimate or illegitimate. So in truth, a service animal can be very poorly behaved, and pets may be perfectly well behaved. But what really distinguishes these two types of dogs isn't their behavior, but it's the task that it's trained to perform. So if someone says that they feel a service animal can't be legitimate because they heard it bark, or because all service animals wear vests, or because they used a rope as a leash, or similar, I know we have to dig deeper. So if someone, as much as it may be tempting, tries to link the behavior and the task, those really are separate concepts. That often needs to be reinforced several times. So I'll say that one more time. The animal's behavior is distinct from its status as a service animal. So if it is poorly behaved, but it performs a task to assist someone with a disability, it is still a service animal. However, being poorly behaved can be actionable, which can lead up to exclusion off of a bus. For our purposes, that carries over to the paw print program as well, where I make sure to remind both our drivers and our passengers that carrying a paw print isn't a license to have bad behaviors in the animal. So having a paw print does not give anyone any special privileges. Again, all it does is it lets our operators know that I've already asked someone the two questions to our satisfaction, and they don't need to be asked again every single time that they board. Now, we need to make sure that anyone either with a paw print or who has been determined to a service animal is held to those same kind of behavioral standards. However, what is different is that it's performing a task to assist someone with a disability. So it, again, to reemphasize, it can still perform the task while being poorly behaved, and it still is a quote unquote legitimate service animal. Sometimes people can make up rules based on what they feel is right, or maybe somebody heard something on TV once, so it can be helpful to simplify. And at its simplest, there are two questions that we can ask. And just to make sure that everyone's clear, we're just asking, is that a service animal and what task is it trained to perform? And then there's service animals, and then there's not service animals, and that's it. So remember, we have all different kinds of animals, and people might come forward and say, this is my therapy dog, or this is my emotional service animal, or this is my protection animal, or this is my pet. All of those other categories do not enjoy the same protections as service animals under the regulations and the guidelines that we fall within. When somebody's getting to be too heavy-handed when evaluating service animal tasks or behavior, we can always appeal to their values. So we can remind folks that, we're just here to help people. We can't and we shouldn't create any unnecessary barriers to that primary goal. Even when an operator knows that someone is lying, we can remind them to uphold the behavioral standard. So when in doubt, allow the animal, but ensure that the animal maintains its behavior. We can only take action for what the dog does, not what we think that it might do. I think that's a really important point, in that people can and do lie to us about the status of their animals all the time. And we're not detectives and we're not doctors. And so we often aren't going to be able to dig deeper than that. Remember, we have exactly two questions that we can inquire about the status of the animal. So a deeper dive on that often is going to create an additional barrier to someone with a disability, which could lead to a complaint or a lawsuit. So we're just flat out not allowed to take an additional action on top of that. So even when we suspect that someone is lying, unless there's some kind of obvious cue, it's typically not going to be actionable. And if what they've done is they've told us that their animal performs a task to assist them with a disability, we are required to allow them to board, but we still can maintain that behavioral standard. Finally, for even the most stubborn, we can let them know that their behavior increases liability for their organization. So if we ever err on the side of not allowing a service animal, we can risk a lawsuit, and we've just violated the rights of someone with a disability. So those are just some of the types of things that may come up over the course of training and sharing this information within your own organization. So I tell you that just as a caution. And there's a couple of other just types of folks that we may encounter during training or when we're discussing the do's and don'ts of service animals. So not infrequently, I'll have operators volunteer to me that they actually never bother asking questions about anyone's dog. So they tell me asking the questions only seems to make people mad. And back in the day, when they would ask a supervisor, the supervisor would just always tell them to let their dog on board. So now they don't waste any time asking the passenger or a supervisor. Sometimes this service animal stuff can feel complicated or downright impossible. People may seemingly give up by, instead of asking 2 questions, they won't ask anyone any questions. And if everyone gets to ride, then no one will complain about being excluded, right? Well, no. We have to remind our operators about responsibility. So if someone is really unsure of what to do in a situation, it's not always appropriate to make a decision in a vacuum. Making a snap judgment in exigent circumstances is different from avoiding decisions altogether. That's what their supervisors are for. We also need to let our operators know that not upholding the rules makes life difficult for coworkers, and it makes enforcement inconsistent. So if someone is waved on by one operator and then get questioned by another, it makes for an awkward situation for everyone. Sometimes operators are just afraid of making a mistake. We need to remind our colleagues that they will be supported for doing the right thing, even when a customer complains. So one example I use is for when operators may be running late and get frustrated that they have to stop and ask questions or secure someone's mobility device. I remind them that we're not here to have an empty bus go around in circles, always on time. What we're actually doing is transporting people. And within some reasonable limits, that means getting out of the seat and interacting once in a while. When a supervisor questions why an operator is running behind, if that answer is that they were assisting someone with a disability, they're going to be supported and even praised. So if none of that works, we can always remind our operators that their actions can, again, increase our liability. If you ever err on the side of not doing due diligence, we risk a lawsuit. Nowadays, buses are cameras on wheels, and if an operator is on tape not asking any questions, and someone's pet comes on board and bites a service animal or someone's child, that's not going to be a good look for the department. That's come up here in Oregon in the past. If you ever err on the side of not doing your due diligence, that creates liability for the organization. And notice that we've gone through a couple of examples where either allowing too many or too few dogs on the bus can potentially increase the risk of a lawsuit. There's a sweet spot in the middle that requires some critical thinking, and it's not generally a good practice to allow operators to take one of those extreme positions. Sometimes an employee will have a form, someone else's business cards, phone numbers, or a brochure ready to go so they can just get back to the driving. Providing information is great, but accessibility needs to be everyone's responsibility. Sometimes people struggle with the uncomfortableness of not having all the answers, and they want someone else to do the work for them. This is understandable, but it's just simply not good customer service to make someone wait for a response or to navigate complicated bureaucracy. And if someone has to go through any unnecessary hoops to access services just because they have a service animal or because they identify as someone with a disability, that can create a discrimination problem. Simple and reasonable requests should be accommodated on the spot. And if we can't do that, then it becomes everyone's problem. One way I'll illustrate this concept for operators is that at Lane Transit District, we have a very clear policy of no eating food on the bus. We have it written into our manual, our training materials. We have pictograms on the bus reminding people not to eat food. It all seems very clear and black and white. However, what about when someone says to the driver that they're diabetic and they're experiencing hypoglycemia? Can they eat that fun-sized Snickers bar that they brought with them? Well, of course they can. And the wrong thing to do in this circumstance would be to make someone fill out a form for a reasonable modification request, to make an exception to policy, to have your attorneys review it, to get back to them in a few weeks. And in the meantime, you're going to be calling an ambulance because we didn't handle the request correctly. Part of being a good team player is that everyone wants to work with employees who can take on their share of the responsibilities. There's balance to that. And we've already talked about the other extreme and when operators need to know when to fold them. So we can remind operators that there will be times that you have to ask for advice and get support, and that's great. But we expect that everyone can work with people with disabilities and handle basic requests. So it's one thing to go through examples and role plays and do research on this topic, but as practitioners, we need to be ready for situations in which there may not always be a clear answer or guidance. So this concept can really be a struggle for some, but we need to find ways to reframe it as empowering. We're not asking anyone to memorize every technical assistance manual that has ever been published, and that's a good thing. Instead, we need to remind our colleagues that we reasonably expect them to use good judgment and common sense to help someone with a disability get where they need to go. And as fellow humans, we'll even expect that they make some mistakes along the way. And it's important that we consistently provide support when we could have done better. Okay, so I've got some time left at the end just for some questions, and now's a great opportunity to give me your hardest. So let's really try and make me do some homework. I love it when I get stumped, and I'll try and point out if there's anything Oregon specific that may not necessarily apply in your own jurisdiction, but please, let's see your questions. So let's see, we've got a question. What prevents someone from using a card, a paw print for any other animal? Well, that's a good point. And part of what I very quickly went through is that there's an educational component that goes along with getting a paw print. So part of that conversation includes a discussion that people need to revisit back with me if there's any change in circumstances. So, you know, over time, people will change animals, and oftentimes that's a very quick conversation or just a reinforcement or update if there's been any changes in our policies or procedures, but typically along with guiding people on our policies and procedures, that if they have any change in circumstances, that they need to be proactive in meeting with us. Now, I'll also go back and saying, there's also people who may choose to lie. And so at the end of the day, there's nothing that would prevent someone from using a card or not using a card for just flat out choosing to lie to the answers to the 2 questions upon boarding, that it would allow them access to be on public transit. But at some level that gets into beyond what we're able to accomplish with our 2 questions, as well as the due diligence that we rightfully should. So if we get much deeper than that, we're at the point where we're creating barriers for folks who would otherwise need to be able to access the service above and beyond what could reasonably expected of them. So it's a really great question, and there are significant components that we just didn't have time to get into more detail that are included as part of that report available on our website that goes into education in both for riders, service animal handlers when they're receiving the paw print, as well as for operators as kind of some of the practitioners and folks that need to be able to uphold the behavioral standards. So let's see, a couple other questions have come up. I'm going to start with, what is the definition of a service animal for the purposes of your policy? And so in short, a service animal is an animal that is trained to provide a specific task to assist someone with a disability. And so that's, it's most distinct from what many folks would consider or call a emotional support or emotional assistance animal. So the main distinction is that an animal through its presence alone may provide some comfort, and that actually can be grounds for being allowed an animal in many other contexts. So in, say, like an apartment, oftentimes somebody would be allowed to have an emotional assistance animal in a no pets apartment. And it's just through the presence alone. The animal isn't trained to actually do anything. It's just by hanging out, it provides a benefit to the user. And one good way of thinking about this is based on the need and the benefit to the individual. So when you look at something like housing in an apartment, it's just at the absolute most essential to an individual. Like we're really getting at very core needs. And public transit, I like to think of that as maybe just, you know, kind of half a step or a little bit further away from that, where we make kind of the broadest, some of the broadest accommodations in a housing environment. Public transit is just kind of right on the next level, where you know, we've got fairly broad protections for service animal use, and for us and for transit and per DOT regulations. That definition for us of what is required to be allowed is that it's an animal that's been trained to perform a specific task to assist someone with a disability. So not a natural dog behavior, but a specifically trained task. People can self-train, can be trained through an organization. It can't be something that the dog just learned how to do on its own. It has to be something that someone has trained the animal to do to assist them due to a disability. So that's a good question. Let's see, what have you found to be the best way to educate the public on the true definition of a service animal? That is a great question. So I will say both within and outside of transit, folks aren't always on the same page about what is or is not a service animal. And I will say that's not due to any one person or organization's fault. It can be legitimately a bit confusing. So if someone's allowed to have their animal in their no pets apartment, obviously it's going to feel a little bit confusing why they're not allowed to have it on the bus. And context is really king for that. So there's different rules and regulations everywhere you go, and it's hard to stay on top of those for everyone. So we're fortunate that we generally get to focus just on the regulations for transit and the DOT regulations, but most people, I would say, are familiar with the DOJ regulations. And I'll go so far as to say that on some level, I would be doing a disservice to over heavily promote the DOT interpretation of the ADA, because generally for most people, the DOJ regulations are going to be what's more salient and what applies. And so particularly we're just talking about the bus and public transit. And so I usually use that as a context. And I'll usually say that oftentimes when members of the public have a different regulation that they're referencing, that's going to be what they generally use for their day-to-day life more often. And so I'll just say, you know, that definitely will apply to you for your apartment or when you're on an airplane. But while you're on the bus, just know that these are the regulations and they are a little bit different that you're used to, and to just acknowledge that that there can be some different interpretations based on the context. And so I'll say that it's a good point that there needs to be an education piece to the public, but I will also say that's to a point, and to recognize that there will be other accurate interpretations of the regulations based on other contexts outside of transit. And we're within the transit environment for our day-to-day, but not everyone spends all their time on or near a bus. And so they may reference something like the DOJ regulations a little bit more closely. And so I would just be cautious to say that our interpretation is some kind of universally correct or right way to interpret the regulations. They're just appropriate for one context, and they could potentially change over time. So the DOJ interpretation, I believe that came out in 2010. It could be that DOT decides to follow suit or do the same, and that could actually be something that we could guide as an industry. So good question. Let's see. So someone mentions they operate a zero fare service. And so how do you incentivize it when it's already free? So I will say that's a great question. So I would say the half fare component is just kind of an added kind of incentive to the card, but not the main incentive from a rider perspective. So what I've heard often from many of our riders is that it's the unnecessary kind of conflict that can come along with an interaction that makes a barrier for public transit. So it's getting asked multiple times a day. And so if you imagine you're a service animal handler and you're getting asked about the status of your animal or what task it's trained to perform, and you just get asked the same questions 10 times a day, every day of your life, you just reach a point where you're having a bad day and you're getting really sick of this. So people can snap, they can take things out on a driver, they can be a little bit rude sometimes even. It's just through no fault of their own, they're just trying to navigate this world and with the rules that are laid out for them, and everyone's trying to do the same. But it can be a lot to ask of somebody. Just somebody wants to go to work or go to the grocery store or get to the hospital without getting asked all these questions like anyone else is able to do. And so I would say the biggest advantage and the incentive that we offer as far as participation in the Pop Rent program is that it gives people this opportunity to expedite boarding. It's like skipping the line. It's being able to have a more efficient and easier way of being able to board or otherwise be able to participate in public transit. And that's what I hear is kind of one of the big wins that we're able to offer to our riders. Now, in addition to that, if there's kind of some additional efficiencies that can be added, and for us that happen to be participation in half fare, great. There may be other things that are specific to your district that I would be aware of or otherwise know of that you can include. And I would say be creative and explore those things and work with your local disability communities to find out what those are. What are the needs that you could better meet through a program like this? So I'm always very cautious to say that what we found to be very successful here at Lane Transit isn't a cookie cutter method that can be equally applied anywhere throughout the country. It really needs to be tailor-made to meet the needs of the community that you're serving. And so for us, one component of that was half fare. I say that doesn't necessarily need to be, I definitely don't even see it at Lane Transit as being kind of the most important or integral component, but it's one of those things that while we're asking for someone's time and participation, are there other things that we can offer that makes that an even easier or better experience? So good question. All right, let's see. We've got a question. How do you handle a rider when they have a service dog that tries to run out in front of a bus and the handler loses hold of its leash? So the rider says that the dog does everything for her. Oh, another good one. The dog, so this is a multi-part. The dog has a broken leg. Oh, this is specific. And she is taking it to the vet for a recheck. The dog got hit by a car. She throws papers she carries with her of her online certifications and past lawsuits from other states she has filed. So what would be the best way to handle this? Well, this sounds very, very specific. So let me generalize it just a little bit. So I'll say context is key, and I've mentioned that in a lot of different ways, but I'll say in a short comment, I'm not going to know all of the circumstances, and there may be things that are relevant to the rider that I'm not getting out of this comment, but I'll try and break it down into some of the basic components of this. So when someone loses hold of a leash, that's generally a behavioral issue, and it's actually a problem with the handler, not the animal. So someone may drop a leash, and if the dog just sits there and does nothing, then no problem for anyone, right? But if the handler loses control of a leash and then the dog starts going out of control and running around or running in front of a bus, then that's a problem. So service animals need to be under the full control of their handlers at all times, and that's typically going to be through a leash. However, it's not necessarily required. So someone might say, I have a disability where I might lose function of my hands and I might drop a leash, and that's okay. It's under my full voice control at all times. It's never not under my control. So if someone can demonstrate that the animal's under their full control, we can typically make an accommodation or a modification that wouldn't require a leash. And in fact, if someone demonstrates that they are unable to use a tether of some kind like a leash, then we would definitely be required to allow something like voice control or another means of demonstrating that the service animal is under their full control at all times. However, that means that for behavioral issues, they need to be fully on top of it, and they are responsible for those. So if the dog goes off and has some behavioral issue, they do have some kind of responsibility for that. And in fact, I would venture to say a conversation with this, a rider like this, just about kind of that dynamic would be helpful. So let me see if there's some other parts to that. Yeah, so the paperwork as far as online certifications and past lawsuits. So I would say things like online certifications, typically, they're not federally recognized. There's no national registration or certification program for service animals that's really relevant in our context. There's a lot of websites you can go and pay your $20 and get a card that says this is a a service animal. But I would say that it could be that it displays information that could be relevant. So if someone, I'll give you a classic example. Somebody is nonverbal and has a card that lets you know what task their service animal performs. Now, it doesn't matter if they bought it online or if they wrote it themselves. If it tells you what task their service animal performs, they've done their due diligence at that point. That's definitely a service animal. Similarly, I'd say if somebody throws a lot of paperwork around or if they reference past lawsuits, there may be something written on there that tells you everything that you need to know, but in itself, it doesn't. So just based on that, I go back to somebody telling me PTSD. Well, what tasks does the animal perform? I still don't know. So just because someone's filed a lawsuit or has an online card doesn't actually give me that information. So we have to do a little bit deeper digging. So thank you, great question. All right, so we've got a question. What if an individual with a service animal requests to use the lift and take the service animal on that lift in order to board the bus? Sounds great. So typically standees are gonna be allowed, and there's typically not gonna be an issue if a service animal wants to take a lift with a handler. If there's some kind of safety concern, that would need to be addressed, but otherwise that wouldn't be an issue. Briefly discuss operator training. Oh, so I would say it's very important that all employees and operators be well trained. And so we started out with an hour for every employee, and I cut it into classes of generally around 10 to 12, and to reinforce that at least annually. And I will say it's actually important for not just operators, but all employees to be trained. So somebody might come up to your customer service counter, have interactions with your public safety department, just come into your main offices and make a request. And everyone in all levels of the organization needs to be able to know how to handle requests from service animal handlers. So I would say through reinforcement, I've also noticed that refresher trainings, it takes a little bit of time for some of this stuff to click. And so I mentioned as part of this presentation, just kind of some of the things that I tend to be aware of or notice in many different types of people. So those are just things to be aware of, but more is better. And I fully expect that when I do a training for employees, people may bring out like 2 or 3 concepts or remember those throughout the year if I'm lucky. And so typically the ones that I want people to take away is to be able to use me and their supervisors as a resource, that they don't have to have all the answers, but the expectation is that they're helping people with disabilities have an amazing experience and get where they need to go. So if they're doing that, we feel like they're doing a job well done. And then we try and go through role plays and other examples and get into some of the more complicated stuff too. So I try and make it really personal and specific to our transit district when we're doing training, more so than I would today. So let's do one more question and then we've got to wrap up. So how do you address emotional support animals, especially if someone claims PTSD or another emotional issue? We allow them in an enclosed carrier. So typically we'll say it's not a problem to bring them on board. They just need to be safely and fully enclosed so that they don't, go after another service animal or a child or someone else on the bus, or try and lunge after someone's food. We don't have a requirement to allow them outside of a carrier, and so we choose not to. Though a district could certainly choose to have its own policy that is more broad, we find that there can be enough problematic interactions that we require animals that aren't service animals just to be an enclosed carrier. And that still allows people to go to a vet or bring them with them to wherever else they need to go. Just needs to be safely enclosed so it doesn't become an issue for other passengers, other animals on the bus. Having multiple dogs in a confined space can be tough, even for the most well-trained animals. So we just try and minimize any potential negative question or consequences to that. So I know folks had some really amazing questions. If there were any left over, I'll see if I can get to those via email or otherwise. Please feel free to follow up or use me as a resource. Mainly, I just want to make sure to thank everyone for your time today, for your really thoughtful questions, and just taking time to listen about what we've been doing at Lane Transit and I hope you'll continue to be able to use us and rely on us as a resource as you begin to set up your own policies or procedures or refine them in your own transit agency. So thanks everyone so much.
Thanks, everyone. This is Karen Souza, and I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. It has been recorded. It will be on our website tomorrow. You will be able to get access to the information. And again, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. This is a regular membership series webinar that we provide for our members. And thanks for your participation.